Picture this. It's November 30th, 1939. The temperature has plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Snow blankets everything in sight. And through this frozen wilderness, 500,000 Soviet soldiers are marching toward a tiny nation of just 3.5 million people. This isn't a fair fight. This is supposed to be a massacre. The Soviet Union, one of the world's superpowers, has just launched a full-scale invasion of Finland. Stalin expects his Red Army to be in Helsinki within 2 weeks. Soviet propaganda is already celebrating the inevitable victory. Foreign observers are placing bets on how many days Finland will last. But something extraordinary is about to happen in these frozen forests. Something that will shock the world and rewrite the rules of modern warfare. This is the story of the Winter War, a story of impossible odds, brilliant tactics, and a nation that refused to surrender. This is the story of how David didn't just fight Goliath, he made Goliath bleed. To understand the Winter War, we need to go back. Back to 1917, when everything changed. The Russian Empire, which had ruled Finland for over a century, collapsed in revolution. As the Bolsheviks seized power and Russia descended into civil war, Finland saw its chance. On December 6, 1917, Finland declared independence. For the first time in 700 years, after centuries of Swedish rule followed by Russian domination, Finland was finally free. But freedom came with a price. Almost immediately, Finland descended into its own brutal civil war. Reds versus whites, communists versus nationalists, brother against brother. When the dust settled in 1918, the whites had won, but the wounds ran deep. Over 36,000 people had died in a country of only 3 million. The trauma of that civil war would shape Finnish politics for decades. Meanwhile, next door, something even more dramatic was unfolding. The Soviet Union was born from the chaos of revolution, and under Vladimir Lenin, it began to take shape. But when Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle erupted. By 1929, one man had emerged victorious: Joseph Stalin. Stalin was paranoid, ruthlessly paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere, and he had the power to do something about it. Throughout the 1930s, he launched the Great Purge, a campaign of terror that would kill hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, including his own military officers. By 1939, Stalin had executed or imprisoned over 30,000 Red Army officers, including 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and half of all brigade commanders. Think about that for a moment. Stalin had deliberately decapitated his own military. The experience, the institutional knowledge, the tactical expertise, gone. Shot in basement cells or sent to die in Siberian gulags. But in Stalin's twisted logic, loyalty mattered more than competence. An incompetent loyalist was safer than a brilliant potential rival. And there was another problem brewing. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun, and Stalin was terrified that Finland, sitting just 20 miles from Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, could become a staging ground for a German attack. Stalin wanted a buffer zone. He wanted security. He wanted Finland to give up territory. Throughout 1938 and 1939, Soviet diplomats made increasingly aggressive demands. They wanted Finland to cede several islands in the Gulf of Finland. They wanted to lease the Hanko Peninsula for a Soviet naval base. They wanted Finland to move its border on the Karelian Isthmus back 25 kilometers, further away from Leningrad. In exchange, Stalin offered a larger piece of nearly worthless wilderness in Soviet Karelia. It was like someone demanding your living room and offering you a swamp in return. The Finnish government, led by a coalition of parties, faced an impossible choice. Their foreign minister, Elja Serko, was adamant. Giving in to Soviet demands would only invite more demands. Finland had to stand firm on its sovereignty. But Finland's greatest military mind, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, saw things differently. Mannerheim was a fascinating figure, a former general in the Imperial Russian Army who had fought for the Tsar, but who had returned to his native Finland during the Civil War to lead the White forces to victory. He knew the Russians. He had served with them, fought alongside them, understood their thinking. And Mannerheim was deeply worried. He believed Finland should make some concessions to buy time and peace, because if it came to war, the mathematics were terrifying. The Soviet Union had a population of 170 million. Finland had 3.7 million. The Red Army had over 1.5 million men under arms. Finland could mobilize perhaps 300,000. The Soviets had thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland had virtually none. If Stalin wanted Finland, there was no way to stop him militarily. The best Finland could hope for was to make the price high enough that Stalin would reconsider. But the Finnish government rejected the Soviet demands. On November 13, 1939, negotiations broke down completely. Stalin was furious. If Finland wouldn't submit peacefully, he would take what he wanted by force. The Red Army began to mobilize along the border. On November 26, 1939, the Soviet Union staged a false flag operation. They claimed that Finnish artillery had shelled the Soviet village of Mainila, killing Soviet soldiers. This was a lie. The shelling had either been done by the Soviets themselves or never happened at all. But it gave Stalin his pretext. The Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with Finland. On November 30th, at 8 a.m., without a declaration of war, Soviet bombers appeared over Helsinki. The Winter War had begun. The Soviet plan was straightforward. Overwhelming force, multiple fronts, rapid victory. They would attack across the entire 800-mile border. In the north, Soviet forces would drive across Lapland and cut Finland off from Norway and Sweden. In the center, they would push through the wilderness toward the city of Oulu, splitting Finland in half. And in the south, on the Karelian Isthmus, the narrow strip of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, a massive Soviet force would smash through Finnish defenses and drive straight to Helsinki. Soviet commanders told their troops to pack dress uniforms for the victory parade in Helsinki. They expected to be there within 2 weeks. The numbers seemed to support their confidence. On the Karelian Isthmus alone, the Soviets massed 21 divisions, nearly 450,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. Facing them were 4 Finnish divisions, roughly 130,000 men, with almost no tanks, virtually no anti-tank weapons, and only 114 aircraft, most of them obsolete. The Finns did have one advantage, the Mannerheim Line. Named after Field Marshal Mannerheim, this was a series of fortifications built across the Karelian Isthmus during the 1920s and 30s. But here's the thing. When we hear line of fortifications, we might think of the Maginot Line or the Atlantic Wall. The Mannerheim Line was nothing like that. It consisted of about 150 bunkers and pillboxes, mostly made of wood and earth, scattered across 65 miles of wilderness. There was no continuous line of fortifications, no deep concrete bunkers, no extensive underground networks. It was a defensive system held together more by terrain, determination, and clever use of the landscape than by steel and concrete. But it would have to do. The first Soviet assault on the Mannerheim Line began on December 6th, ironically, Finland's Independence Day. Soviet tactics were brutally simple. Mass your artillery. Shell the Finnish positions until the earth itself seems to scream. Then send in wave after wave of infantry and tanks. But something strange happened. The attacks stalled. The Finnish defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that shocked the Soviet commanders. Machine gun nests hidden in the forest opened fire at point-blank range. Finnish artillery, though vastly outnumbered, was expertly commanded and struck with precision. Small Finnish units would appear seemingly out of nowhere, attack Soviet supply columns, and vanish back into the woods. And the Soviet tanks, those symbols of modern mechanized warfare, were proving surprisingly vulnerable. Finnish soldiers discovered that these iron monsters had a weakness. The infantry accompanying the tanks couldn't keep up in the deep snow. This left the tanks isolated, slow, and exposed. The Finns improvised. They took bottles, filled them with gasoline, stuffed a rag in the top, lit it, and threw. The Molotov cocktail, named mockingly after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, became Finland's answer to the Soviet tank corps. But the most effective anti-tank weapon was even simpler: courage and a satchel charge. Finnish soldiers would ski right up to Soviet tanks, slap an explosive charge on the side, and ski away before it detonated. It required nerves of steel, but it worked. Still, the pressure was immense. Day after day, the Soviets attacked. Day after day, the Finns held. But they were being ground down, losing men and ammunition they couldn't replace. While the battle raged on the Karelian Isthmus, something even more dramatic was unfolding in the forests to the north. Here's where the geography gets important. Most of the Finnish-Soviet border runs through absolute wilderness, endless forests, frozen lakes, minimal roads. The Soviets assumed they could simply march through this terrain with their superior numbers. They were catastrophically wrong. In the center and north, Soviet divisions advanced on narrow roads through dense forest. The Finns called these roads corpse roads, and with good reason. The Finnish defenders, vastly outnumbered, developed a tactic called moti. The word means a cubic meter of firewood, a stack of logs cut to size and ready to burn, and that's exactly what the Finns did to Soviet divisions. Here's how it worked. Let the Soviet column advance deep into Finnish territory. Don't confront them head-on. Wait until they're strung out along a narrow forest road, supplies at the back, tanks at the front, command in the middle. Then attack from the sides and cut the column into segments, into motis. Suddenly, instead of one cohesive division, you have a dozen isolated pockets of Soviet troops cut off from supply, from command, from mutual support. They're surrounded by forest and snow and Finnish soldiers who know this terrain like the backs of their hands. The Finns would then systematically destroy each pocket. Ski troops would appear, attack, and disappear. Snipers would pick off officers and anyone who looked important. Finnish artillery would shell supply depots. And all the while, the temperature kept dropping. -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius. The Soviets weren't prepared for this. They wore summer uniforms because their commanders had promised this would be quick. They marched in columns because that's how you move on roads. They lit fires at night because otherwise they would freeze to death, but those fires made perfect targets for Finnish mortars. And the Finns? They wore white winter camouflage. They knew how to survive in the cold. They moved on skis, could navigate by stars and instinct, and could travel through terrain the Soviets thought was impassable. The most famous of these encirclements happened at Suomussalmi. In December 1939, 2 Soviet divisions, over 25,000 men, pushed along the road toward Suomussalmi village. The Finnish defenders numbered barely 4,000. But they were commanded by Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo, a master of mobile warfare in winter conditions. Siilasvuo's men cut the Soviet 163rd Division into motis. For weeks they squeezed these pockets, attacked supply lines, and prevented any relief. The Soviets, trapped in the forest, slowly froze and starved. When a second Soviet division, the 44th Rifle Division, arrived to rescue the 163rd, Siilasvuo ambushed them too. This division, considered elite, was destroyed in detail. The Finns captured 43 tanks, 71 artillery pieces, hundreds of vehicles, and thousands of small arms. Soviet casualties at Suomussalmi exceeded 24,000. Finnish casualties were around 900. Somber music. Narrator. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't a glorious adventure. This was desperate, brutal survival. Finnish soldiers fought in conditions that would kill most people. They dug positions in frozen ground. They slept in snow holes. They went days without hot food. Frostbite was epidemic. Men would pull the trigger on their rifle and their finger would stick to the frozen metal. And the casualties were mounting. Finland had started the war with perhaps 300,000 soldiers. They couldn't replace losses like the Soviets could. Every dead Finnish soldier was a son, a brother, a father from a tiny nation where everyone knew someone who had died. The Finnish civilians were suffering too. Soviet bombers struck Helsinki and other cities, killing civilians in violation of international law. Food was rationed. Families huddled in bomb shelters, and every day brought news of more dead, more wounded, more missing. But the world was watching. And the world was amazed. By late December 1939, the Winter War had become an international sensation. Newspaper headlines around the world proclaimed Finland's incredible resistance. Finns smash Soviet attacks. Red Army routed in snow. David versus Goliath in the north. Foreign journalists flocked to Finland. They filed breathless reports about Finnish ski troops, about soldiers fighting on frozen lakes, about civilian women digging tank traps while bombs fell. Time magazine named Mannerheim its Man of the Year. Finland became the ultimate underdog story, but there was a darker edge to this international attention. For many Western powers, this wasn't just about Finland. This was about the Soviet Union. Remember, this is 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union had just shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between the Nazis and the Communists. Britain and France, now at war with Germany, saw the Soviets as essentially Nazi allies. The Soviet invasion of Poland from the east in September had only confirmed this view. So, when Finland fought back against Soviet aggression, Western powers saw an opportunity. If Finland could be supported, if the Red Army could be bled and embarrassed, it would weaken the Soviet Union and potentially disrupt the Nazi-Soviet alliance. Britain and France began planning an expeditionary force. The plan was audacious. Send troops through neutral Norway and Sweden, ostensibly to help Finland, but also to seize control of the Swedish iron ore mines at Kiruna. These mines supplied crucial raw materials to Nazi Germany. Cutting off this supply while helping Finland seemed like a win-win. There was just one problem. Norway and Sweden refused to grant transit rights. Both nations were desperately trying to maintain neutrality and avoid being dragged into the wider war. They sympathized with Finland, Sweden especially, as Finland had long cultural and linguistic ties to Sweden, but they wouldn't risk their own destruction. So the Western military help never came. What arrived instead were volunteers. Approximately 12,000 foreign volunteers made their way to Finland to fight. They came from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Britain, the United States, and dozens of other countries. Some were idealists who believed in Finland's cause. Some were adventurers seeking glory. Some were simply people who hated communism and saw a chance to fight it. The Swedish volunteers were especially significant. Over 8,000 Swedes crossed the border to fight for Finland, making up the largest contingent of foreign fighters. For many Swedes, Finland wasn't really a foreign country at all. Swedish was one of Finland's 2 official languages. Many Finnish citizens were ethnic Swedes. The countries shared centuries of history. The volunteer units fought bravely, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the strategic situation. Finland also received material aid. Weapons, ammunition, aircraft, and supplies arrived from Sweden, Britain, France, Italy, and other nations. The United States, officially neutral, couldn't send weapons, but did provide financial credits and humanitarian aid. But here's the brutal truth. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. By January 1940, Finland was running out of everything. Ammunition was being rationed. Artillery shells were counted like gold. The Finnish Air Force, which had started the war with 114 aircraft, was down to fewer than 50 operational planes. And the Soviets? They were learning. Stalin was humiliated. His quick war had turned into a grinding nightmare. The Red Army, which was supposed to be invincible, had been bloodied and mocked by a nation of farmers and lumberjacks. Stalin's response was typically brutal. He sacked the commanders who had failed. He brought in new leadership. And, most importantly, he brought in Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko was one of the few competent Soviet commanders to survive Stalin's purges. He took one look at the situation and began making changes. First, he reorganized the command structure. The multiple competing Soviet forces were unified under single command. Communication improved. Logistics improved. Second, he changed tactics. No more mindless frontal assaults. Instead, Timoshenko planned methodical, concentrated attacks. He would mass overwhelming force at specific points on the Mannerheim line, blast a hole in the Finnish defenses, and pour troops through. Third, he brought in reinforcements, lots of them. By February 1940, the Soviets had nearly 1 million men on the Finnish front, backed by thousands of artillery pieces and aircraft. The Soviets were finally using their overwhelming numerical advantage intelligently. And the Finns, exhausted and depleted, couldn't hold forever. On February 1st, 1940, the Soviets launched their final offensive. For 3 days, Soviet artillery pounded the Mannerheim line with unprecedented ferocity. Over 300,000 shells, more than the entire Finnish artillery had fired during the whole war, rained down on Finnish positions. Then came the assault. Soviet troops advanced not in mindless waves, but in coordinated attacks supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Where the Finns held, the Soviets would bypass them and drive forward, isolating the strong points. The Finnish defenders fought with the same courage they had shown all winter. But courage couldn't conjure ammunition that didn't exist. It couldn't replace dead men or repair destroyed bunkers. It couldn't stop artillery shells or hold back tanks when the last anti-tank mine had been used. Slowly, section by section, the Mannerheim line cracked. On February 11th, Soviet forces broke through at Suma. Finnish reserves rushed forward to plug the gap, but there were no more reserves after that. On February 17th, the Soviets broke through at Leda. The entire Finnish defensive system was collapsing. Field Marshal Mannerheim, commanding from his headquarters, faced the hardest decision of his life. He could keep fighting, his men would continue to resist, but Finland would be destroyed. The Red Army would eventually reach Helsinki, and then what? Occupation? The end of Finnish independence? Annexation into the Soviet Union? Or he could seek peace, on whatever terms could be obtained. Even before the final Soviet breakthrough, Finnish leaders had been desperately seeking a way out. In late February, with Finnish defenses crumbling, the government sent representatives to Moscow to negotiate. The terms Stalin offered were harsh, far harsher than what he had demanded before the war. Finland would cede the entire Karelian Isthmus, including the city of Viapuri, Finland's second-largest city. They would give up territory near Salla and Kuusamo in the north. They would lease the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviets for 30 years. All told, Finland would lose 11% of its territory and 30% of its economic assets. The Finnish negotiators tried to bargain, but they had no leverage. Soviet troops were advancing. The Mannerheim line had fallen. Foreign military help wasn't coming. Every day of continued fighting meant more dead Finnish soldiers and more lost territory. On March 12, 1940, the Finnish government accepted Soviet terms. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed at midnight. At 11 a.m. on March 13th, the guns fell silent. The Winter War was over. The human cost was staggering. Finland suffered approximately 70,000 casualties, 26,000 dead, 44,000 wounded. For a nation of 3.7 million, this was devastating. Nearly every family in Finland had lost someone or knew someone who had been lost. Soviet casualties were far higher, though exact numbers are still debated. Conservative estimates put Soviet losses at 126,000 dead and 265,000 wounded. Some historians believe the true figures were even higher, possibly over 200,000 dead. Think about those numbers. In 105 days of fighting, the Soviet Union, attacking a country 1/50th its size, suffered casualties that exceeded all American combat deaths in the Vietnam War. But casualties were only part of Finland's loss. 420,000 Finns, 11% of the population, had to be evacuated from the ceded territories. They were given just days to pack up their entire lives and leave. Homes, farms, businesses, churches, cemeteries, all had to be abandoned. These refugees, called the evacuees, were resettled throughout Finland. But you can't easily replace a home where your family had lived for generations. You can't recreate a community scattered to the winds. The psychological scars would last for decades. Pause. Narrator. So, who won the Winter War? On paper, the Soviet Union won. They took the territory they wanted. They established their buffer zone. Finland was forced to accept humiliating terms. But in every other sense, this was a Soviet disaster. The Red Army had been humiliated. Its weaknesses, poor leadership, rigid tactics, inadequate training, terrible logistics had been exposed for the entire world to see. The myth of Soviet military invincibility had been shattered, and someone was watching very carefully: Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been impressed by Soviet might. Now he saw only weakness. Many historians believe that the Red Army's poor performance in Finland contributed directly to Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, might never have happened, or might have happened differently if the Winter War hadn't revealed Soviet vulnerabilities. Stalin, who had started the war expecting a quick, easy victory, instead got a bloody nose and international condemnation. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, the first and only time a nation was expelled for aggression. Soviet prestige was damaged worldwide. But Finland? Finland survived. Against all odds, against impossible mathematics, Finland remained independent. The Finnish state endured. The Finnish people endured. They paid a terrible price, but they were still free. The story of the Winter War didn't end in March 1940. In many ways, it was just the beginning. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland faced another impossible choice. The Soviets were still their enemy. They had taken Finnish territory, killed Finnish soldiers, bombed Finnish cities. Now Germany was offering a chance for revenge, to reclaim what had been lost. Finland joined Germany's attack, though they insisted they were fighting a separate continuation war rather than being German allies. For 3 more years, from 1941 to 1944, Finland fought against the Soviet Union. They initially reclaimed the lost territories, but eventually Soviet counteroffensives pushed them back. In September 1944, Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. Then, in one of the most bizarre episodes of World War II, Finnish troops spent the next several months fighting German forces, their former co-belligerents, to drive them out of Finnish Lapland. When World War II finally ended in 1945, Finland had somehow survived again. Unlike the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were absorbed into the Soviet Union, Finland remained independent. It cost them even more territory and heavy reparations, but the Finnish state endured. For the next 45 years during the Cold War, Finland pursued a delicate policy called Finlandization. They maintained independence, but were careful never to antagonize the Soviet Union. They stayed neutral, maintained friendly relations with Moscow, but also maintained connections with the West. It was a tightrope walk that required constant diplomatic skill. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Finland finally gained full freedom of action. In 1995, they joined the European Union. And in 2023, in a development that would have shocked people in 1940, Finland joined NATO, the Western military alliance explicitly created to counter Soviet and Russian power. But what are the lessons of the Winter War? What can we learn from this story 85 years later? First, there's the lesson about assumptions. The Soviets assumed that superior numbers guaranteed victory. They assumed that a small nation couldn't resist a superpower. They assumed that intimidation and overwhelming force would make the Finns surrender. Every single assumption proved wrong. The Finns showed that determination, preparation, and intelligent tactics can offset numerical superiority. They proved that defending your homeland gives you advantages no amount of equipment can match. They demonstrated that knowing your terrain, your capabilities, and your enemy can matter more than raw strength. Second, there's a lesson about leadership. The Soviets had purged their military of experienced officers out of political paranoia. The result was catastrophic tactical failures that cost tens of thousands of lives. The Finns, by contrast, had leaders like Mannerheim and Siilasvuo who understood modern warfare and were given the freedom to make decisions. Competent leadership matters. Experience matters. Professional military expertise matters. Political loyalty cannot substitute for tactical skill, and anyone who thinks otherwise is setting their forces up for disaster. Third, there's a lesson about the nature of power. The Soviet Union was a superpower. It had a massive army, industrial capacity, vast resources, but power isn't just about what you have. It's about how effectively you can use it. The Soviets had all the advantages, but used them poorly. The Finns had almost nothing, but used what they had brilliantly. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there's a lesson about will. Finland could have surrendered. They could have accepted Soviet demands before the war. They could have given up when the odds became impossible. Nobody would have blamed them. But they didn't. They chose to fight, to resist, to make the price of conquest so high that even victory would taste like defeat. And in the end, they preserved their independence, the thing they valued most. Today, you can visit the battlefields of the Winter War. The bunkers of the Mannerheim Line are still there, now museums. The forests where Finnish ski troops ambushed Soviet columns are quiet and peaceful. Memorials mark the places where men fought and died in the frozen darkness. In Helsinki, there's a memorial to the women of the Winter War, the women who dug trenches, operated anti-aircraft guns, served as nurses, kept the economy running, and held society together while the men fought. Their contribution was every bit as vital as any soldier's. And scattered throughout Finland are smaller memorials in churches and village squares, listing the names of those who never came home. If you read those names, and there are thousands of them, you begin to grasp the true cost of the Winter War. These weren't just statistics, they were individuals. People with dreams, families, futures, all sacrificed for their nation's freedom. The Finns have a word, sisu. It doesn't translate perfectly into English, but it means something like determination, resilience, courage in the face of adversity. It means continuing to fight even when victory seems impossible. It means refusing to give up even when giving up would be rational. The Winter War is the ultimate expression of Sisu, a tiny nation impossibly outnumbered, fighting in conditions that would break most armies, somehow holding on long enough to survive. Not to win. They couldn't win, the mathematics were impossible, but to survive with independence intact. On November 30th, 1939, when Soviet bombers appeared over Helsinki, the world expected Finland to collapse within days. Foreign observers prepared to watch a quick conquest. Stalin prepared for a victory parade. But 105 days later, when the guns finally fell silent, the world had witnessed something extraordinary. A small nation had stood against a superpower and survived. The Red Army, supposedly invincible, had been bloodied and humiliated. The myth of Soviet might had been shattered. Finland paid a terrible price. They lost territory, lost lives, lost homes and communities. The scars of the Winter War marked Finland for generations, but they remained free. They remained independent. They remained Finnish. In the final analysis, that's what the Winter War was about, not territory or strategic buffer zones or spheres of influence. It was about the right of a small nation to exist, to determine its own fate, to refuse to be swallowed by a larger neighbor simply because that neighbor had more guns and tanks. The Finnish soldiers who fought in those frozen forests, outnumbered and outgunned, didn't die so that Finland could win. They died so that Finland could survive. And thanks to their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of everyone who endured that terrible winter, it did. When we remember the Winter War, we should remember it not as a victory or a defeat, but as a testament to what people will endure to remain free. We should remember the impossible courage of those who fought, the terrible cost they paid, and the precious thing they preserved. Because in the end, Finland survived the Winter War. And sometimes, against impossible odds, survival is the greatest victory of all.